to speak before such an audience. And as I sat there quivering, popping Valium in the antecedent chamber there, I thought, now, Greg, what's his name, the cricketer's head, Greg Chappell's head is a matter of some interest to me, but I'm going to talk about some other heads. I'm going to tell you about how I came to write the book, The Exceptional Brain. What I was really interested in was what makes us different as a species, as a people, as a group. And I spun off from that. Obviously, when you choose the word exceptional, it's open to some kind of argument and debate. And I make no apologies for the fact that in the book, it's a highly idiosyncratic choice of individuals that I did. I focused on artists because I believe artists represent the best aspects of our nature. So I had 3 painters, Leonardo da Vinci, Vincent van Gogh, and Frida Kahlo. I had a ballet dancer, Václav Nijinsky. I had a musician, Woody Guthrie. I also had to put in some bad people because, of course, bad people are an aspect of the human experience just as good people are. So I had some obscure criminals, including one who could have been Jack the Ripper. I had the most notorious con man of the 20th century, Trebitsch Lincoln, and of course, I had to put in Adolf Hitler, who's been a long-term interest of mine in my studies. So I chose a few other individuals who many people won't have heard of. Some will have heard of Anna O, the world's first psychoanalytic patient. I doubt if many people will have heard of Bale, the first psychiatrist to actually discover the cause of a psychiatric illness just after the French Revolution. And I'm not sure if many people will know Arthur Inman, the world's greatest diarist, who wrote 17.5 million words over a period of 40 years, obsessively describing every aspect of his daily life. He inflicted his genre of at least 156 volumes on Yale or Harvard University, and it took a professor 7 years to boil it down to 2 large volumes, each of which could break your foot if you dropped them. To everybody's surprise, they thought it was going to be a small academic run. It's become an absolute success. They've gone to the 3rd edition. There's been talk of a play and a movie. But these are the people I chose for my book. The question is, what was I trying to say? Well, I immediately chose one basic point. The mind is a wonderful thing, and you're going to hear a lot of it at this talk today. However, I was going to focus on the brain on the grounds that it was material and we could see the changes, we could measure them. And I was also going to look at a long-standing interest of mine, how this was affected by evolution. And here's the technical part of the talk, so you can all go into narcoleptic coma for the next 5 minutes. Homo sapiens, our species, has been around for fully 200,000 years. We've not changed really much except for a few things like our teeth have shrunk since then. The question is, what makes us different? What makes us unique? How do we differ from the primates that came before us, and even our cousins, the Neanderthals that we eliminated in the world's first genocide? Well, you can sum it up by this famous equation, almost like Einstein's E equals mc squared. And the equation is this: symbolism equals language. Because what distinguishes us from every other species is this capacity for language. To define symbolism, which goes along with it, it is the capacity to transmit and store information outside the human brain. Remember, the human brain has this skull wrapped around it, and it cannot get any bigger. So we had to work out ways of storing information and transmitting it. There's a huge argument amongst archaeologists, anthropologists, prehistorians, paleontologists. What are the characteristics that make us different? They call it modernity. Now, language is clearly the key issue of modernity, but it's got a number of components. This is not just talking, the capacity to talk, but the capacity to communicate. In our species, language also involved artistic and creative activities, and the capacity to believe in another world. And we see this in earlier findings, how amongst the first human activities was burying people. Shamanistic activities, people who wanted to travel to other worlds. And of course the manifestations of this, rock art, rock sculpture, carving, that kind of thing. All of these are the characteristics of modernity. There's one other thing which is worth remembering. Was also, initially, we don't need it now, the capacity to design three-dimensional stone tools. Stone tools have been around for a very long time, 2.5 million years. But three-dimensional stone tools meant you took a chunk of shapeless rock, you could see inside what shape you wanted, you could design it, you could chop it out, and you could teach somebody else. In other words, it was the setting up of an industry. These are the characteristics that made us unique and the characteristics of modernity. But what capacity did we need to do that? Quite simply, the brain developed what we roughly call the language center. Now, if anybody's been to an autopsy and seen a brain, it's like a giant pickled walnut. But if you look at the brain, on the back, on the right-hand side, there's a bulge out there, and this is approximately where the language center lies. Remember I said the brain cannot expand because of the skull, so how did it fit it all in? And what it did was it rotated. We are the first species to have an asymmetrical brain. And this is the key issue. The extent to which a brain rotates, the technical term is lateralizes, determines your capacity for language. Now, the matter would have rested there until people started looking at people with schizophrenia, people with autism, people with dyslexia, and they started finding something interesting. Their brains were not fully rotated, not fully lateralized. This led to a lot of doom and gloom. In other words, your brain is either properly lateralized or it isn't, and there's something wrong with you. We've moved a long way away from that. It's a much brighter picture, because what we've now discovered is that there's a range of lateralization, and that varies in every human being. There's an argument that there's one gene that does it, but I won't bring that into this discussion. The extent of lateralization determines your human personal capacity. And that's why we've moved away from these ideas. Look, if you've got something like autism or schizophrenia, you know, there is something wrong with you. You lack capacity. You are defective. We're now seeing that people whose brains aren't as lateralized or vary in their lateralization are amazing in all sorts of ways. They're eccentric, they're strange, they're odd, they're creative. They are sometimes just plain brilliant. They don't necessarily fit in, and this is the capacity that determines our individual variation. Now, the second thing is to say to you, the brain is essentially a big electric motor. Nothing more, nothing less. It runs at a certain voltage. When some part of it wants to work, the voltage goes up. If you look at the language center, which we used to call the temporal zone, but now it's a bit more complicated, it's called the temporolimbic zone. This is where a lot of things happen. The capacity for language, creativity, mood, emotion, religious feelings, and a lot of related things. Now, all of this works on electricity. And one day, a neurologist called Norman Geschwin sat and looked at this and said, what happens if this area of the brain is running, and we'll just use a model here, not at 4 volts, which it should be, but at 6 volts? Well, what happens to any motor if you power up the voltage? It runs faster, not necessarily better, and it may overheat. And from this, Norman Geschwin came up with what we now call the Geschwin syndrome. He found this in temporal lobe, people with temporal lobe epilepsy, who have a higher voltage between convulsions, and some of these people presented in a very interesting way. Characteristically, they had hypergraphia. Remember I mentioned Arthur Inman. Hypergraphia is compulsive writing. Geschwin referred to it as the intellectualized expression of heightened affect. It doesn't only mean writing, it could mean many other aspects. Take an example of no less than Pablo Picasso. By the time Picasso was 3, he would grab anything, even bits of food, to make drawings. Till the day he died, I think in his 90s, Picasso was modeling things, drawing things, painting things. That's another expression of hypergraphia, and it makes the point that hypergraphia is not a pathological phenomenon necessarily. The second thing was religiosity. What is religiosity? It doesn't mean deep spiritual beliefs only. It means an intense commitment to religion to an extent that goes beyond the normal level of belief. It's a rancorous, hyper-moralistic kind of religious belief that you inflict on others. You're very critical of them. And I wrote a chapter in the book on the prophet Ezekiel, which led to a very painful encounter with all the Orthodox Jewish students at Carmel College, to give you an example of this. Because Ezekiel was absolutely remorseless in his criticism of people who weren't worshipful enough. In the old days, if you went down to Hyde Park or one of these places where there were demonstrators and speakers, and you saw somebody with a sign up there saying, "The end of the world is nigh, repent ye sinners," you could be fairly certain if it wasn't somebody with a delusion, it was somebody with this kind of religiosity. There were several other aspects of this syndrome. People were cranky, extremely irritable. They had very poor social skills. They were the sort of people, and believe you, I know this, if you're talking to them and say, "The discussion is over, I'm going," they will follow you and keep talking to the closed door. In other words, no understanding of social barriers. And finally, a kind of a sticky, viscid thinking. It's as if their thoughts stick together, which is very notable. Those were the two principles, plus a few others that I applied in writing the book and looking at the various characters. Now, as the clock frighteningly ticks away, I've got to cut this down, so I'm going to give 3 or 4 case discussions. The first one I want to talk about is Leonardo da Vinci. Now, nobody's going to argue that Leonardo was one of the greatest, if not the greatest painter of all time. But Leonardo was much, much more than that. He was a phenomenal thinker, a scientist. There's almost no area of human endeavor that he did not look into, speculate, write about, and postulate. Leonardo was described by Kenneth Clark as possibly the most curious man who ever lived. And you can see this in his writings and his diaries. He was remarkably perceptive. Ideas like solar cells, hovercraft, helicopters, pumping systems, double hulls, all came from Leonardo. Even in our field, well, speaking for most of the speakers here, neuroscience, it's worth remembering that Leonardo discovered 2 of the sinuses in the face and the skull that we didn't know about, and a technique of injecting beeswax into the brain so that you could see the outline of the ventricles, which of course preceded the techniques we use for MRI scans and CAT scans today. Now, Leonardo was, of course, well known for his paintings, and possibly even more well known for the fact that he never finished them. In fact, he never finished a lot of things he did. But what's more interesting about Leonardo was his compulsive writing and diarizing. His diaries are the most fabulous things to read. They have all his pictures, his drawings, his scientific thinking, and the most amazing trivia, a shopping list of what I'm going to do today. What's the weather like? What did so-and-so say to me when I bumped into him in the street? There's no item that Leonardo did that he did not put in his diaries. And these have been the most fantastic source of our thinking of undoubtedly what I believe is the greatest intellect who ever lived. Now, can we make anything of Leonardo? First thing, let's get this out of the way, bearing in mind I am a shrink after all. There was nothing wrong with Leonardo. He was perfectly healthy, and there's nothing to indicate he ever had any psychiatric illness. In fact, his only problem that we know of was right at the end of his life when he had a stroke several years before he died. But we know 2 things from Leonardo's diaries and from his pictures and from his writings. Firstly, and I say this modestly, he was the greatest left-hander in history. Now, Leonardo pointed out that he was left-handed. There's a famous picture of his hands like this, one of them bearing a pen. It was observed by other people. But there was something else about Leonardo's handwriting. Until very recently, he was the only example we have of somebody who was a constant mirror writer. Now, you know what mirror writing is. Kids like to do it, but virtually every word that Leonardo did was mirror writing. Now, left-handedness and mirror writing, can we draw any implications from that? Mirror writing is not necessarily a pathological phenomenon. Kids do it for fun. Some kids do it when they start writing. Some people do it when they have a certain kind of stroke. In most cases, mirror writing settles down after a while and reverts to the normal. It mostly happens, in fact, almost invariably in left-handed people, and this brings up the issue of, are left-handers better, bigger, and more wonderful? Well, they're better tennis players because, of course, they short-circuit something in the brain and they get the signals quicker. And there is a lot of good evidence that left-handers tend to be better at some activities and more creative. The last part of the Leonardo story that I want to give is the fact that it's only been in the last 10 or 20 years that a Japanese worker has found some other people who have been mirror writers all their life. So Leonardo is not the top of that pile anymore. So I just want to finish off on Leonardo by saying he was undoubtedly the world's greatest left-hander, lefty, and I'm not going to show you what hand I write with. The next one I want to talk about is Vincent van Gogh. Now, everybody knows Vincent as a painter and what a painter he was. There's some very interesting statistics, though. In his short, tumultuous and tragic life, he lived only 37 years. It's worth noting that Leonardo only painted for 10 of those years, the last 10 years of his life. In that period, he did 2,000 paintings in 10 years, something like 8,000 artworks. Towards the end of his life, for example, when he was doing Starry, Starry Night, he was doing the equivalent of a major oil painting every 36 hours. This is a phenomenal output. But this wasn't the only output, because Vincent was a compulsive diary writer. He didn't do it in a diary. He wrote letters to his brother. And on occasions, he would spend all day painting. He could write 3 letters to Theo, and some of them were up to 12, 18 pages long. They were typically hypergraphic. Every line was filled out. There were little drawings. He wrote along the margins of the pages. He put in insertions. He scribbled all over them. So think of this enormous pouring out of painting and of his writing. What else can we tell about Vincent? Well, I can tell you this, and I know there's some neurologists here. Vincent van Gogh has become a minor medical industry. You could fill library shelves with the books on what was wrong with a man. Lead poisoning, digitalis poisoning, bangs on the head, schizophrenia, borderline personality. I'm not even going to enter into that, but I'm just going to mention some other interesting things. Firstly, Vincent's religiosity. He started off life, his first active career was really studying for the ministry. They kicked him out of the school very quickly, and he took a position as a kind of a lay minister in the Borinage, a poor area of Belgium. He went quite berserk. He gave away all his clothes. He lived in a hovel. He went with the miners down underground. He started attacking the church in the sermons, so they sacked him. So this caused a great deal of disillusionment. But again, it brings out to us this element in his nature of religiosity. So he turns against organized religion, but you can see it. It's very well documented how he now says painting, art, is the way to the heavens. The way to God is through doing something creative, and a painting is the best way to do that. And right throughout his diaries, which are now beautifully put out in 6 volumes, is wonderfully edited and free on the net, incidentally, you can see how he equates his painting with spirituality. Now, what else do we see in Vincent that might help us to look at his mind? Well, it's not well known that Vincent's sexuality was a little perverse on occasions. Everybody knows the incident where he lopped off part of his ear, but it's worth remembering that he went to the local brothel where he was very well known and presented the earlobe to them. What I didn't know until I did the research from the book is that he'd been having an affair with Paul Gogh at the same time, and a number of references emerged to Vincent being told he could not have sitters for his paintings because he was basically molesting them in a fairly interesting way. So we can see Vincent's sexuality was kind of different in some ways. On top of that, we have his complete lack of social skills. And a quick example is when he was working in the family art business, he spent his time telling the customers not only was the stuff they sold their crap, but they had no taste and he didn't want to sell anything to them. Not surprisingly, he was told he did not have a future in retail. Now, again, I want to go on to the last person. There are many others I'd like to cover, and that's Adolf Hitler. It's a rather depressing fact that the speculation on Hitler, the attempts to try and understand the mind of the most evil man who ever lived, is reaching a point, according to a recent study I saw, that Hitler will be the most written about individual since Jesus Christ. The problem with a lot of this is that it is speculation about Hitler's mind. Hitler was enormously private. He went to great lengths to hide information about his personal life. So a lot of this remains speculative. I'll just give you one example, the famous statement by a Swiss psychoanalyst that Hitler was an abused child. And yet this completely ignores the historical reality that, in fact, Hitler was spoiled rotten by his mother and really rather privileged and protected. So that gives you an idea of the risks of speculating about Hitler. If you go on to Hitler from a material, organic, or physical point of view, you get onto more solid ground. When I used to give this talk, invariably somebody at the back, mostly a doctor, would stand up and say, yes, well, of course, Hitler had syphilis. Actually, he didn't. That's one of the things we know for certain. V.I. Lenin had syphilis, but not Hitler. What we know about Hitler comes out from a rather interesting source, the surviving movie footage from very early in Hitler's political career. And already in 1936, when Leni Riefenstahl did the movie Triumph of the Will of the Nuremberg rallies, there are signs there of Hitler having a tremor, starting to twitch, and showing some rather interesting neurological symptoms. By 1939, when World War II broke out, there were some interesting comments from diplomats. The French Prime Minister and a Swedish diplomat who had been in meetings with Hitler to try and defer the war. Hitler would work himself up into one of his famous rages, but while he was doing this, they observed his face suddenly went completely ashen. He seemed to pause in his speaking, and his eyes rolled upward uncontrollably. And then after a few seconds, he seemed to get control of himself. Now, this is what we call an oculogyric crisis. And this is, again, a neurological phenomenon of considerable interest. The war goes on, and we see two things. By the time of the loss of the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler's health has plummeted. People around him say he's aged 10 years, and they can see it physically. He is tremulous, he is stooped, he's bent over, he's shuffling. He's got such a tremor of his left hand that he has to keep it wedged behind his back for control. He's barely able to sit down because he's so rigid and he needs someone to push the seat under him. Well, it's pretty clear to people with a limited insight that he's got Parkinson's. Unfortunately, his quack doctor, Theo Morel, couldn't have diagnosed Parkinson's if it was written on a band and put on his head, so Hitler was left alone until the very dying days in February 1945, when Morel finally decided he had Parkinson's and gave him something to that effect. Now, what does this mean? Well, firstly, there's another interesting aspect of Hitler's condition that came up. From being a complete non-entity before 1919, Hitler was a person you would have said, this person will go nowhere in life. Forget about ruling Europe, he's a nothing. After 1919, we see this person with remarkable persuasive powers. He becomes the leader of Germany, and he wins amazing military victories. But when you look at the historical study, by the time the war studies, there's something interesting. Up till then, Hitler had been completely sure-footed in everything, politics, government, what he did. From that on, he became not compulsively, utterly indecisive. Before making the decision to invade France, he changed his mind 20 times. This is a very difficult thing if you're about to do an invasion. You see the same thing with the invasion of Russia and the decision when to start the Battle of Kursk. So if you add these things up, we have somebody at a relatively young age with Parkinsonism and associated indecisiveness and oculogyric crises. What could this be? Well, we all know Parkinson's, which our elderly relatives, my mother for example, get with aging, but that is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's syndrome is something you get at a much younger age, and there is a cause for it. People know the story, for example, of Muhammad Ali, who's got Parkinson's syndrome from too many bangs on the head. The question is, what could have given Hitler Parkinson's? And we go back to late 1916, early 1970, the trenches on the Western Front. There was an outbreak of a bizarre illness never seen before. Most of the soldiers essentially went to sleep. A number of them, possibly 40%, died, but those who survived were very interesting. Some of them remained in a semi-coma, a semi-sleep state. And you'll know who they were. You've seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, and those were the people who had encephalitis lethargica as discovered by a wonderful guy, the Renaissance man of 20th century psychiatry, Konstantin von Economo. But what von Economo noted, that amongst the survivors, a lot of them developed Parkinsonism and an amazing personality change. They became the greatest con men you would ever encounter. The literature in the 20s and 30s is full of stories of these glib, persuasive people who would go around reaping absolute havoc, free of any conscience, unable to do anything. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm fighting a clock here, but there are many theories of Hitler, and I'd like to think that that's one that people would consider seriously. I'd love to have talked about Woody Guthrie. I'd like to have talked about Arthur Inman. But mostly what I want to say is end up with a comment from Charles Starling, who won the Nobel Prize for physiology. The brain, he said, is an enchanted loom. And I'd like to think, in the work we do today, in the things we're going to talk about today, and even to a small extent, the cases I've told you about, a little bit of the magic has been exposed. Thank you very much.